And got it. All right, there we go. All right, welcome and good afternoon to the nonprofit and philanthropic leaders and representatives. My name is AJ Davis, and I represent the Low Country Black Parents Association. And I'm honored to have the privilege of welcoming you to our debriefing about some very detrimental legislation that is currently making its way through the South Carolina General Assembly. I will kick it off to my colleague, Ms. Letitia Vaughn, to do the introductions, but to let you know that this is a working group, a coalition, if you will, of several organizations to include the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the South Carolina ACLU, the E3 group, as well as the Jewish Coalition led by Brandon Fish, who are here to make sure that our state does not become besieged by the very toxic and detrimental legislation we see in other parts of the country. So without further ado, Letitia, I pass off to you.
Thank you so much, AJ. And again, welcome to all who are joining us this afternoon. I do want to make everyone aware that this session is being recorded. In June of 2021, my organization, E3, that I co-founded with Audrey Lane, convened a group of interested stakeholders around a comment that was made by Molly Spearman about critical race theory. The group was very interested in engaging around how we begin to do a better job of working with the Department of Education around issues specific to Black and Brown children and families. Fast forward to later this year, in 2021, we decided to re-engage after being alerted to pending House and Senate bills that were being heard in committee hearings, which has led to our current coalition, as AJ stated. So the Truth in Ed SC Coalition is a diverse group of individuals and organizations across the Palmetto State whose mission is to protect and expand the teaching of diverse and inclusive history in South Carolina. Currently, the coalition is engaging in the ProTruth SC campaign, fighting against several bills in the South Carolina House and Senate that could prohibit and censor the teaching of history and current events in Black, Indigenous, Jewish, and LGBTQ+ communities. The proposals, which you will hear about later on in this presentation, censor educators also in K-12 schools, colleges, and universities. But they're not just attacking equitable and inclusive education, they're also targeting organizations and businesses that serve our communities by prohibiting training on concepts related to race, religion, politics, gender identities, and sexual orientation. And so later on in the presentation, and actually I'm going to pass it on, you're going to hear about these bills and the potential impact that these bills could have during this briefing for nonprofits and businesses. We know that schools and communities should be safe and affirming for all people, regardless of background. And proposals like these in other states have led to chilling effects on Black History Month events, attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, including book banning and dangerous targeting of educators that are already overworked and underpaid. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter, who will begin to present information about the bills and the potential impact that these bills could have on nonprofits and businesses in the region. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to share my screen so y'all can see our PowerPoint presentation, and I will pass it over to my colleague, Hamida Labi, who is a policy counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. So Hamida, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, S, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited that you were able to join us today and looking forward to engaging you at the end of this presentation. So next slide, S. So as Letitia stated, this is a diverse coalition. We just wanted to share some of those founding members. I won't go over that in detail since she already shared, but we do want to mention that outside of this founders group, we have a ton of individual and members, organization-based members that are from across the state that have been working together to fight these efforts. Next slide. Next slide. So what is this attack about? You know, they've been using this term, you probably have heard it in the media, but we wanted to share exactly what critical race theory is and what it is not. That is the subject of these bills. So critical race theory is a graduate level academic and legal framework that denotes systemic racism is a part of American society. As has been discussed in written testimony and oral testimony and across the media, this is a academic framework that is primarily discussed at the law school level and is not in K-12 classrooms, despite some of the messaging that is being perpetuated about education in this country. Critical race theory, we think, despite the fact that it's not taught in K-12 classrooms, is a good thing. It's helped us to recognize that racism is more than just a result of individual bias and prejudice, but is embedded in our systems. And so some of those examples, when we think about disparities in education, is South Carolina being a great example of a state where there are huge racial disparities in housing, employment, healthcare. We can look at the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, and many other ways that we know that systemic racism and other forms of disparities exist. This helps us to understand the story of our nation's history in a way that centers Black people and their history and experiences. Legislators have, in the process of these hearings, which started in late January, have demonstrated either a sincere misunderstanding of what critical race theory is, but in some cases, an acknowledgement that they know that this is not the definition of critical race theory that they are taking up in the bills, and they're attempting to redefine it. They have referenced this definition as something that is snowballing, referred to it as their own colloquial definition of what that is. And they've plainly said that they will define it however this body chooses to define it in the legislation. And so this is very concerning, and we wanted to be sure before we go into the details of the bills that you actually know what critical race theory is and what it is not. Now, explanation of what it is not will be made clear in discussions of how it's defined in the bills. Next slide. So as an overarching view of what these 5 bills are, there is one bill in the Senate that has not had movement. So we'll be focusing on these 5 bills in the House for this presentation. These bills are currently in the House Education and Public Works Committee. These are the 5 that are being considered. We do want to note that in moving forward, the committee has indicated that they plan to take pieces of each of these proposals to create one committee bill. But we wanted to make sure that you were fully aware of which instruments are currently being considered and could be potentially pulled from to go into what that final bill looks like. For the purposes of this conversation, we are going to focus primarily on those last 2 that you see in bold because they cover nonprofit organizations, businesses, and others that receive state funding. But these are the 5 anti-truth bills being considered by the committee. These bills seek to do many things, and we wanted to focus in on these 3 areas. So one, it seeks to prevent a truthful and accurate teaching of American history. It covers K-12 schools. Some of them even go further than K-12 and go to early education and mention preschool. They also extend to higher education classrooms, both public and private. They seek to dictate how businesses and nonprofits create corporate culture, impacting your ability to create programming or other initiatives within your organizations or companies that benefit your employees. And they seek to erase the history and current perspectives and experiences of marginalized community, which include communities of color, Jewish people, LGBTQ people, and more. These bills will overall create an atmosphere that is hostile to open and respectful inquiry and discussion. Next slide. So we talked about what the accurate definition of critical race theory is, but now let's talk about some of the ways that these bills incorrectly define critical race theory. And we'll note that some of these bills don't specifically state CRT in the text. And that's why we say some key prohibitions. Some of them name critical race theory, some of them don't name it. But the conversation in the committee is centered around that topic. So let's go through some of these prohibitions. I won't, for the sake of time, go through all of them, but I wanted to highlight a few for your awareness. So, for example, if you look at number 2, one of the prohibitions includes teachings, trainings that individuals should be discriminated against or adversely or favorably treated on the basis of their race. So what does this look like in practice? Some of the conversation around this piece in the committee has been that white supremacy is in the past. This ignores many current events that are clear examples of white supremacy still being a part of our society, including in very recent history, where a 21-year-old that had been indoctrinated walked into a Black church, Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and murdered 9 African Americans during Bible study. This is not something that is in our past. This is still something that people deal with today. I also wanted to note as an example, affirmative action being another example of this. When we talk about favorable treatment on the basis of race, an example of that could be banning affirmative action programs and things that are anti-racist in practice. If we look at number 4, this gets at topics around unconscious and implicit bias. We know that best practice has been for companies and nonprofits to begin to do more trainings with their employees on how to recognize their own internal prejudices or biases that they may hold, be it positive or negative, and how when we confront those things and become aware of those, how that could help us to be better colleagues, better students, better employees. We know that this is a positive practice that helps to improve inclusive culture as a part of organizations and businesses, and this is something that could be prohibited under these bills. Next slide. A few things here. One to pull out is there was a big topic of conversation as well. How do we talk about slavery and racism? These bills say that slavery and racism cannot be discussed as anything other than a deviation or betrayal or failure to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States. So this could prohibit discussions that would be historically accurate to discuss that slavery was a part of the founding of this country and that people that founded this country were also enslavers. So if this is passed into law, is that a part of our history that could be erased? Next slide. This is also very important that we wanted to pull out with some of you because we know some of the work that you all engage in. This concept that equity is superior or should supplant the concept of equality being included as a part of this bill. When we talk about educational equity, when we talk about health equity, they are misconstruing the difference between equity and equality. And we know that people do not start out in the same place. And so in order to close existing gaps, sometimes there needs to be a focus, whether that's from the business community, nonprofit community, or government agencies, local governments that are recognizing disparities in particular areas. And in order to bring about equity, sometimes it requires an intentionality around focusing on those communities that have been historically left out of the process and not provided resources. And if something like this passes into law, will those organizations or agencies still have the ability to provide funding, to provide pass policies that seek to promote equity over equality, which the latter, which may not close these gaps that many of you focus on in your work. Also want to pull out here with number 9, in a theory that would be very hard to implement. We think this is overly broad and very vague. A teaching or training that would result in an individual feeling discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress based on his or her race or sex. Some of the examples that were pulled out and included, discussed as a part of the hearing, were images of a sit-in during desegregation efforts, where Black college students were desegregating lunch counters, and some of the images of that, and a parent raised that as an example of something that their child should not have to see because it could cause them, discomfort. But this is a part of our history, and certainly the individuals and communities that withstood those actions would want those stories told, and as opposed to having to erase that because it may cause someone else to feel discomfort. These are factual events in our history that led us to where we are today, and they're seeking to prohibit conversations around that. Another example of that is a film that was shown about the Holocaust, and a parent, I think it was a grandparent, that considered that what they called a horror film. This is another very important piece of world history that all of us must learn from to ensure that nothing like that ever happens again. But this is something that some parents and grandparents said that they don't want their children exposed to. And that is very concerning and very dangerous. On number 10, some examples of the concepts that are not universally accepted or considered controversial that they specifically call out in the bills that apply to businesses and nonprofits include the existence of genders other than male and female and gender fluidity. It includes non-binary pronouns. It's again lists unconscious or implicit bias as a controversial topic, and that race and sex are social constructs. So those are some of the very concerning examples of what will fall under number 10. This is not the complete list of all of the prohibitions, but these are some of the ones that we wanted to highlight for you today. Next slide. So let's take a closer look at the 2 bills that focus on, or include rather, nonprofit organizations and businesses. House Bill 4799 includes any entity that receives funding appropriated by the General Assembly. It says that you may not provide training, workshops, forums, or programming to employees or members of the general public on concepts related to critical race theory. One of the things that we wanted to pull out here is that it also includes some of the things that we just named, but also any claims, views, or opinions that are in the 1619 project. We have highlighted in our previous materials that this is more than a 600 page document that documents historically accurate stories and aspects of our history. And so not only is it saying that you cannot use the 1619 project as an instructional material or training material, but any of the concepts that are included, any of the claims, views, and opinions here that are included as a part of that project cannot be discussed in classrooms or in the workplace. So that means that there are events in our history that if they just happen to be a part of that project may be prohibited. It also prevents schools from awarding grades or course credit for student work or service learning with organizations engaged in social or public policy advocacy. There were some examples of this, as there were students who came to have their voices heard about how this may impact their universities. And perhaps some of you work with children or older students and on issues that are particular to your mission. And that could be implicated here in this section. It also prevents South Carolina businesses that receive public funds from providing employees with training on unconscious bias, as we mentioned. Yes, so next slide is on 4605, House Bill 4605. This has a very expansive list of covered entities. It says that, it includes any state-funded entity, and we wanted to name out what some of those examples are that are enumerated in the bill: public and private and charter schools, public and private institutions of higher learning. This includes historically Black colleges and universities, as well as others, preschool and child care providers, public and private institutions, generally state and local government, businesses and nonprofit organizations, contractors, subcontractors, consultants, subconsultants, vendors, labor unions, anyone who receives directly or indirectly state-funded contracts. So a very expansive list of people covered under this bill. And it prohibits you from, quote unquote, subjecting individuals to or requiring the completion of instruction, presentation, discussions, or counseling that touches on many of those topics that we just named. An important element here that we want to pull out is that this is not just about what the company itself and the employees of that company will do, but you see that it also includes any training conducted on the premises remotely or by a third party. So again, anyone, maybe you don't conduct diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, but perhaps you bring in an organization to help, your employees get that sort of exposure and lessons in professional development. And you would still be on the hook for bringing in an organization to conduct that sort of professional development for your employees potentially. It also includes a provision that says that individuals, your employees and staff could not be separated based on race. And it includes here living arrangements, purposes of employment, and any other activities. We wanted to highlight here, perhaps some of your organizations or companies have affinity groups, especially because of certain communities that have been historically underrepresented in certain industries. And so perhaps there are, ways that you all allow employees that have shared identities and shared experiences to connect in the workplace. Or maybe you are an organization that helps businesses to do that sort of work, and that would be potentially prohibited under these bills. These bills not only have expansive prohibitions and entities that they cover, but they have very severe penalties. Here are some of the examples. This would indicate the public being able to contact the state's attorney general to implement this bill. You could risk losing millions in state funding, tax exemption status, and any other state accommodate privilege. The money that would be withheld would not be able to be returned. And if you look at 4799, it not only precludes you from receiving money for 1 year after that, maybe you cure this area that they're saying that you were, something that you're doing that violates these bills. They don't implement that for a year. They're saying for the next 10 years, you'll become ineligible for state funding. And we also wanted to note when it comes to funding appropriated by the General Assembly, that that's not only direct state funding, but that could be federal funding that is appropriated by the General Assembly. So there are multiple, streams of funding that could be included and, impacted by these bills. Next. So how do these bills impact you? We believe, as Letitia said, that schools, workplaces, and communities are supposed to be safe and affirming places for all people, regardless of your background. And these bills could create uncertainty and confusion about how would these be implemented. We think that nonprofit organizations that are dedicated to addressing the various forms of systemic inequality and businesses that are working hard to improve diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace should not be barred from taking such action or being sanctioned for taking such action. And the language in these bills create a lot of confusion around how would you all be able to continue to do that work without potentially having millions of dollars for years on the line, or having to get a call and investigated by the Attorney General's office because you are engaging in work that actually is positive for the communities that you serve. We're concerned that because of the vagueness of the language, that it could lead to non-meritorious investigations. Again, anyone could report a school, an individual, a company for violating these provisions. And as we said, we think that it could harm your ability to create programs and initiatives that are positive and could combat and help to prevent discrimination in the workplace. It could harm tourism, and we wanted to highlight this because this could, of course, impact state revenue in the long term. Public libraries, museums, and other sites dedicated to the preservation of accurate history and tourism across the state could be impacted by these bills. That accounts for 1 in 10 jobs in South Carolina. And in 2020, that industry, the tourism industry, brought in almost $24 billion. And a substantial portion of that are from activities and landmarks that are tied to South Carolina's history on race, including, the rich history around the Gullah Geechee community. So how would that be impacted? How does that impact students and businesses if these were passed into law? How is this playing out in other states? We don't have to wait for these to pass to see some of the other ways that this is spiraling. Attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in Alabama. There have been reports of educators who were doing Black History Month programming, book banning. We can look at Texas and Tennessee as an example of states that are starting to ban books after passage of either legislation or state board education resolutions that include some of this same language. And dangerous targeting of educators that are already overworked and underpaid. And South Carolina is in a place right now, like many states coming out of this pandemic, where there is a historical teacher shortage. And so this tracking and sort of micromanaging and punitive approach to education and others is not something that is, helpful for the state right now, or ever. If these bills passed into law last year, local governments, nonprofits, and businesses that have worked to address disparities throughout the pandemic could have been severely penalized and stripped of resources. Overall, this is a politically motivated effort to censor classrooms, workplaces, and avoid addressing complicated truths about American history. And that is what this coalition is working to defeat. So the next step in this process, as we mentioned earlier, that these are some of the highlights of the 5 bills that have been discussed. They ultimately will pull pieces of each of these together and create what they're calling, their committee bill. We are in the process of monitoring that. We want to name that the majority of the written and oral testimony in each of the hearings and throughout this process has been in opposition. And this coalition, the Truth in Ed Coalition, remains committed to asking not for carve-outs, but for a full-on rejection of any of these proposals that could silence honest discussions of our country's history and our ongoing problems with systemic inequality, that could deny the experiences of Black, Indigenous, Jewish, and other people of color, women, LGBTQ people, and more. The legislators should be investing in supporting schools, businesses, and communities that are inclusive, diverse, and promote accurate teaching and training on the history of South Carolina and this nation. So we are so happy that you are here with us today, and we are calling on the nonprofit and business community to stand in solidarity with us in this space that we are in with the creation of the committee bill, to not only oppose these pieces of 4605 and 4799 that do specifically attack nonprofit and businesses, but to oppose all of them, because passage of any of these bills and how they can impact schools, whether it's K-12, higher ed, will harm South Carolina communities for us all. And these people eventually will graduate and will be a part of South Carolina's workforce. And what are the ways that we want to prepare them? What are the things that they need to know to become conscious, responsible employees and contributors to our communities? So, we ask that as we discuss some of the ways that this targets nonprofits and businesses, that you still keep in mind how the targeting of education implicates impact for you, even if that's in the long term. So I will pass it back to Est.
Yes, thank you so much, Hamida, for that. And we're gonna have opportunity for folks' reactions and questions in a little bit. But I wanted to actually pass it back over to AJ and a few others from the coalition to share how you're already seeing the impact of these bills in South Carolina. So AJ?
Thank you, Est. And again, thank you, Hamida, for your tremendous work alongside your colleagues from the ACLU and the Legal Defense Fund. And thank you to all who have joined us and who have been here. I had the fortune of attending 2 public hearings at the State House regarding these bills, and sitting in the chambers and listening and watching the testimony provided by individuals on all sides. And one of the clearest things that I can say that these bills are doing and have done is set the tone that the term equity is under attack, and the language of social justice is also under attack. As it was said earlier, it is not about critical race theory as a concept. They've used that was the Trojan horse. This is about rolling back the progress that was beginning to be made as a result of the social justice protest of 2020. As organizations and businesses, you remember in 2020, after the public outcry of the George Floyd murder, several businesses and organizations began to take the pledge to address racial injustice. Well, what is happening is this package of legislation attempts to prevent such things from happening again by infiltrating our school systems, which have historically been under attack, and basically censoring teachers and administrators from having the opportunity to provide children with a discussion with accurate instruction on that. But even more so, as we've tried to present to you, this spans out into our nonprofit and business sectors by making it almost impossible to have the challenging conversations around race and social justice, as well as inclusivity. In fact, I would go as far as to say, for many people who may have heard of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill that caught national attention, that is what 4605 is. It's just not worded as such. But in essence, they are making it virtually impossible to recognize and respect the LGBTQI community as well as the trans community. And in essence, it has the same exact effect as the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. So I do want people to understand that while you may not think if there are certain carve-outs and provisions made that you think would protect your business or organization, all of these bills in their entirety are poisonous to our entire community. And it is not a safe bet to just think that by being safe as an organization or a business, that this will not have serious impacts on our communities, not just in education, but in general. I would dare say that the organization that I co-founded, the Low Country Black Parents Association, would not even be able to exist if any of these laws are put in place. And I should also note, and I know we didn't talk about it, 4225 or 4525 is actually already in place as a proviso, the Keep Partisanship Out of Civics Act. And that has not been acted upon yet, but from my contact with my social studies and histories teachers in my local school district, they are fearful and have been getting pressure, as well as English teachers and literature teachers, because again, this is about the comprehensive aspect of diverse education. So I'll stop there and let someone else join in if they have something else to say.
Yeah, Brandon, would you mind sharing the Jewish Federation, the work that y'all do and how it will be impacted or has already started to see some impact because of these bills?
Yeah, I'll say that I will say that we have a very robust response to incidents of hate and anti-Semitism as they pop up in schools. We field a rapidly increasing number of complaints from parents whose children are experiencing either hate speech or bullying in our local school systems and are calling us for help. And the fact is that a lot of times schools lean on organizations that have expertise to bring in resources to address these situations where some of the folks in the school might not have experience dealing with. So For example, we'll bring in Holocaust survivors to talk about the history of the Holocaust and connect that to what's going on currently, as well as trainings that we facilitate with the help of the Anti-Defamation League about implicit bias and bullying. And what we're being told is that these initiatives, as well as other initiatives that we've engaged in the past in our schools, will essentially be on the chopping block should any version of these bills pass, for fear of some of these repercussions that are built into the legislation. So even things like Holocaust education or other things that people might not naturally associate with the intentions of bills like this will have consequences outside of what people might anticipate. But our superintendent, Molly Spearman, has said that Holocaust education would be off the table should some of these bills pass, and already in other states like Georgia and Texas and Tennessee, where similar legislation or policies at the board level have passed, we have also seen that the reach of these bills go far beyond what is explicitly articulated in the legislation. And I would imagine that that similar impacts will be felt by other communities that don't, and other organizations that aren't necessarily paying close attention to this legislation, having dismissed it as something to do with critical race theory, which they don't see as part of their purview. So I would encourage my fellow nonprofit colleagues to take a close look and to listen carefully, and to also, grab your colleague from other organizations and let them know that this legislation has a very wide scope and is something that we should all be paying close attention to, even if nonprofits and businesses don't end up explicitly mentioned in the final draft of the bill. They don't need to be for us to be impacted. So I would just encourage you all to pay attention and encourage your colleagues in other organizations to pay attention as well.
Thank you so much, Brandon and AJ, for sharing those thoughts. And I know that there were some questions in the chat, and so I'm going to address a couple of those and open it up to others to answer. And I know Josh, you've answered a couple, and I want to make sure folks saw those questions. One, this is recorded, so after this meeting is done, we will share a copy of this recording for those that want. We can also send out a PDF of those slides that Hamida presented on, and feel free to share those, as Brandon said, with your colleagues and others, so they're clear on the impact of these bills. There was a question that was raised in the chat about whether or not Title I programs or anything that brings children and others up or addresses the extra needs of people with disabilities would be provided. And so the response to that is that, unfortunately, as we've laid out, the way that these bills are written, leave a lot of that things are very vague and open to interpretation. So anybody could complain and say, hey, you're giving these children unfair treatment. That's equity, that's not equality if you're providing extra accommodations. And because it's, state accommodated or state funding, or it's even if it comes from the federal government, it's, dispersed by the state. So those programs potentially could be reported and under attack. And if these bills pass, the Attorney General could investigate, and those businesses or those programs could lose funding. So I need to make sure that that was addressed. I believe there was
one other
AJ.
thing to add to that part with the funding part. There is also language in there embedded that doesn't even allow for private sector funding for these programs if you do business in general with the state. So it's not just that you receive state or federal funds. If you are in fact in a contractual arrangement with the state or a state sponsored organization, they kind of made it where, if you can't even get other outside funding to provide this programming as well. I just want to put that out there.
Yeah. And Josh, could you also share a little bit about kind of that distinction between Title I and how federal law would kind of exempt some of those programs, but there would still be some impact?
Yeah, I mean, so when federal law and state law conflict, let me put myself on video. They conflict, the federal law wins out. If the federal government sees that the state is violating federal law, the federal government can then sue the state. But so, ideally, the state of South Carolina has no right to violate Title I.
Yes,
Chime in for
but
just a
there,
second on that.
go ahead, Hamida.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight, I think one of the, like, that is absolutely correct, both, and one of the dangers is that obviously with litigation, that takes time. And so, you know, the reason why we're hoping to prevent these from becoming laws, so that it doesn't get to that point, because children and individuals can be harmed in the years that, you know, I guess, litigation could be ongoing, and it takes time. And so in the interim, there's harm that can be done before we get to a final conclusion. And we also aren't getting a lot of great leadership from the federal level right now on this particular issue. So this is why we're hoping to defeat these, so that we don't have to, on the back end, bring those sort of challenges.
Absolutely. And to that point, so somebody else asked when would a vote happen? And so as Josh said, the House is on furlough this week, but they'll be coming back next week. So we anticipate that we will hear either by tomorrow or Friday when the next meeting will be. They generally have been on Tuesdays and Wednesdays for the House Full Education Committee to meet. And so, you know, it could be as early as next Tuesday or Wednesday that committee will be meeting again to consider these bills. And they could potentially take a vote on it in that very next meeting. However, if they do present a new committee bill, the hope would be that it would have to, you know, the committee members would need time to read through the bill and process it before they would then take a vote on it. So folks are aware of crossover date is April 7th. And so in order for a bill to be, you know, passed by the House and the Senate and then signed by the governor, they need to be processed through at least one House by that date. So a lot of the focus of our coalition has been to draw this process out as long as possible. And so that, you know, by the time they're taking a vote on it, or if they take a vote on it at all, if we can stop them from taking a vote on it, that'd be even better. That, you know, it would be past that date. And so nothing can move this session, but there's the very real possibility with this being an election year, and we've seen, you know, these bills proliferate in other states across the country, that they would still continue to bring forth such bills like this in the future. And so we really want to make sure that we're staying on our guard, not just for this session, but for future sessions to prevent such bills like this from passing. And there was a comment also in the chat about, you know, we talked about how CRT has been misdefined, but also social emotional learning has been under attack. Cultural responsive teaching has been under attack. PBIS has been under attack, positive behavioral intervention and supports. And these are programs that schools and some businesses and nonprofits have been using, you know, over the last several years to create, you know, better school climate and culture. And they have been seen as, in some of the language in these bills, you know, can be used to attack and remove some of those programs that are very important. And so I'm glad that somebody raised that, because that is another concern that we have. And I'm trying to see if that's all the questions we have in the chat. But are there any other questions or comments that folks have before we talk about next steps and ways that you all can be involved? All right, well, so the first way that you all can be involved, and I'm going to drop this link in the chat. Actually, I didn't send it to the entire group. Let me try this again. So this link is to a letter that our coalition put together, and several of you have signed on to this letter and shared it, so thank you for that. But this is a sign-on letter that we created for businesses and nonprofits that talks about many of those things that we laid out during this briefing about how these bills would impact you specifically, but also just the quality of education in general in South Carolina, affecting future employees and our business and civic leaders. And so we're asking folks to sign on to that letter, share it within your circles, and have others to sign on as well. And we plan to present, you know, once we've gotten sign-ons, we've already got about over 24 sign-ons so far. So thank y'all again for those who have signed on and shared it. But our plan is to present this to the education committee and to share this publicly. But we also have some other asks of folks. So I'm gonna share my screen again briefly. But some of those other asks we have besides signing on to the letter is if on your own, you would issue a press statement or public statement in opposition to these bills or any similar anti-truth bills, because again, we know there's a committee bill that may pull from all of these. And so it may not have that exact same, bill number like 4605 or 4799, will contain elements of all the different bills that we laid out earlier. We also encouraging y'all to meet with members of the House Education and Public Works Committee. And so again, the majority of these bills are before them right now. The one Senate bill we've been tracking hasn't moved, and we hope that remains the case. But to reach out to them and let them know, you can call them or schedule a meeting with them to really let them know that you oppose these bills and you're worried about the impacts that they will have, not just on your business, but on South Carolina in general. We've had a couple of folks write some op-eds that have been published. There's an article that will be coming out soon in Diversity Works that the YWCA penned and talked about the impact of these bills on nonprofits. And so we also think it's very important for the business perspective to be heard about how these bills will impact you. So you can write op-eds, reach out to reporters and let them know your feelings on these bills. We also have a Twitter page at ProTruth SC. So feel free to follow and amplify some of the messages that are on that page. We've been tweeting throughout the hearings, as well as lifting up and highlighting the different examples and impacts of these bills in South Carolina, as well as other states that are passing similar bills. And again, we encourage you to recruit and educate others. We'll be sharing this recording and slides. Feel free to share it in your network. We've also been reaching out to chambers of commerce to ask them to take up this issue. And we've gotten some contacts with some, but they've been very hesitant to really take this on. And so it really needs to come from businesses and nonprofits that are engaged with the chamber to continue to press them to take up this issue and publicly oppose these bills. So those are some of the ways that we're asking folks to get involved. You can do some of these, you can do all of these, but every little bit helps. And particularly before the full committee meeting next week, we think it's really important for you all to reach out and make a statement. So those are the ways that you all can be involved. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to those of us here that are leading this, and we can drop our contact information in the chat. We also have a website, ProTruthSC.org, and also drop that in the chat that you can find more information. We have fact sheets about the different bills. We have other resources and information from, for example, the public hearings that were held. And as updates come, we will be updating that page as well. So there's a lot of different resources that are at your disposal. And we hope that you all will continue to reach out and follow up if you have any questions or have other ways that you want to be involved in this fight.
And Est, thank you for that. I just want to emphasize the urgency. While we definitely appreciate all of you who have joined this Zoom call, I want you to understand that this is not hyperbole. This is not sensationalism. There is a concerted effort to push these bills. One of the things that we did not necessarily focus on, but I want everyone to be aware, there have been organizations that have been established. One most notable is the Moms for Liberty group. That group has been very successful in influencing legislation in other states, as well as here in South Carolina. And as business owners, members of the business community and nonprofit sector, I think it's important that you understand the significance of this, not just for right now, but long term. This is in fact a political issue. Someone in the chat mentioned that it was discussed at the Supreme Court confirmation hearing. So that signifies how important this issue is right now and why we need all hands on deck in this matter. The future, again, of our society with all of the problems we currently have would be in even more danger were we to let any of these bills be put into law, because pretty much, as any of the legal scholars and individuals on this call can attest, once you allow one thing to pass, it makes it easier to push others. So that's why we're asking your assistance today in helping us to not only get the word out, but to push back against this. And I just want to make sure that that was impressed upon all of you.
Absolutely. Thank you, AJ. So we will drop our contact information in the chat. If anybody has questions and wants to follow up, please feel free to reach out to us. There are also some other upcoming events if folks are interested in attending. There will be a critical race theory town hall at the College of Charleston tomorrow at 4:30. And so if you are in the Low Country area, Charleston area, and are interested in attending that, that's another opportunity to engage and meet with students that are very active and colleges that have been very active or trying to be active about this issue. Several have issued resolutions in their staff faculty senates opposing these bills and have called on their university presidents and others to also oppose these bills. The Jewish Federation is also holding an event next Tuesday and talking about how these bills could impact Holocaust education. So that event will be next Tuesday at 6 p.m. I believe, Brandon, right? If folks are interested in continuing to join and engage and learn more about this issue, and there will be other events in the future. So thank you all so much for joining, and we hope that you'll continue to stay engaged and plugged in. And please, please reach out if you have any questions at all. And I think, Letitia, back to you.
We just want to thank you again for taking time out in the middle of the day today to come join us for this briefing. And again, just want to emphasize the urgency of now that you heard from all of the speakers. None of us is as strong as all of us. And so we have to collectively come together around this issue, as well as other issues that are impacting the ability to educate our children and train adults and students in ways that are equitable. So thank you so much and have a great afternoon.